We'll be in Hebrews today, but I want to begin first looking at some of the background of Abraham. Now, we looked at Abraham last week, and this week we're looking at him again from a little bit different perspective, and we're narrowing down on one aspect of his life and his testimony. And in Genesis chapter 22, we see this story of the sacrifice of Isaac and the call that God placed on Abraham's life to do this crazy thing. So if you know the story of Abraham, you know that at this point in the story, Abraham has been following God for many years. And there have been seasons of disobedience, there have been seasons of rebellion, there have been seasons of resistance, but still, generally speaking, he's been following after God. I mean, he left his country, left his people, he started to go out in a direction he didn't even know where he was going. He was used of God and obedient to God and following God. And while there are times of disobedience, we see in him a faithfulness. Well, now as he comes to the very latter days of his life, Isaac, the promised one, has been born. There's great joy in Abraham's family because now the promises of God are beginning to be seen in a very clear and tangible way through his son, Isaac, the promised one. But even still, God is testing him. And so in Genesis 22, we see this story. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now, that's powerful in that we see God calling out to Abraham, and Abraham immediately responds to God, yes? How can I help? What do you want me to do? It's almost like a soldier running in the presence of an officer and saying, standing at attention and saying, I'm here, I'm ready. You tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do it. Because Abraham, by this point, had certainly learned. I mean, when your 90-year-old wife has a baby, you start believing maybe God's going to do what he says he's going to do. So here's what God said. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, just let that soak in for a moment. Can you imagine getting that instruction from God? Here's the promised child, Isaac. You now fully love him. You're fully connected to him. He is the one that the descendants will come from. And God says, I want you to sacrifice him as a burnt offering. What happened? Well, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. There was no hesitation from Abraham. I think at this point in his life, he had finally learned, I will follow God. God knows best. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and he saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and he laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Only Abraham knew. Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. And when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Don't you know he was glad to hear another voice? Here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, And behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." Seems very appropriate. So, we see, first of all, in this unfolding idea of the faith that God provides through Abraham, and the example to us here in Hebrews, we see Abraham's obedience, number one, and we see it from this story in Genesis. We see that God called to Abraham and Abraham responded. We see Abraham's journey of faithfulness and obedience, going with Isaac to Mount Moriah, leaving early in the morning, maybe before Sarah got up, maybe not even wanting to have to talk to his wife about this, carrying all this in his own heart, following the plan that God had for him. And then we see a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of obedience. There's drudgery. Can you imagine the 3 days journey getting there? Always on his head and his heart, thinking, oh my, what is going to happen? The pain that he must have endured, emotionally, spiritually, even physically, the pain he must have endured. And then, with the knife above the head, gripping it to bring the fatal blow, God speaks. And there is great relief. And then there is joy. Like it turned completely around in the matter of a moment. Drudgery, pain, relief, joy. God is good. Well, let's look at chapter 11, verses 17 through 19. So first we see there Abraham's obedience. But secondly, in this passage in Hebrews, we're going to see Abraham's faith. Abraham's faith. Verses 17, 18, and 19 is how we will begin this. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And what do we see in that? First of all, we see the sacrifice. We see sacrifice. A willingness to do everything that the Lord required. Now, there's a lesson there for us. A lesson. Are we willing to do everything that the Lord requires? Are we reading the Word of God, those of us who are Christ followers, and saying, yes, 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 I will do it? Or do we come with conditions? I will do it after I've done this. It's not convenient at this time. I have some other priorities I need to consider first. I think Abraham's life was very much like that until these later stages. And at this point, he is so willing to do whatever God says that he'll even take his son and sacrifice him if that's what God says do. Unfathomable. Linguistically, the idea here of sacrifice, it's given in the perfect tense, and that may not mean much to you. But the idea is, with the perfect tense, it's an action that's completed in the past. So, figuratively speaking, because of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice and because he actually brought the wood, the fire, the knife, the sacrifice, who is Isaac, and bound him and laid him on the altar, he figuratively, symbolically, from a heart perspective, because of his willingness, he sacrificed his son. Now, thanks be to God, he did not physically sacrifice his son because God held his hand back. But he completed the action of doing in full obedience what God wanted him to do. So physically, no, but personally and emotionally, yes. He sacrificed his son. And so we see complete and total obedience from Abraham in that regard. He passed the test. God tested him. He passed. I think the question we have to ask ourselves, would we pass a test that God might give us in the area of obedience? And then next we see in verse 19 there kind of Abraham's reasoning as to why he would sacrifice his son. So you could read this as an outsider looking in and say, well, he must have lost his mind. He was very old. Maybe he had dementia. Who in their right mind would ever take their son, lay them on an altar, bind them, and get ready to sacrifice them and burn them? Who would do that? That's evil. Well, Abraham had not lost his mind, but he had reason. There was a reasoning process that took him to the place of being willing and able to do that, and that is seen very clearly in verse 19. He considered that God was able even to raise from the dead. Now, why does it say that? Well, remember, Isaac is the child of promise. God had said that your descendants will outnumber the sand of the seashore and the stars of the heaven. How could that happen if the only heir and true descendant was dead, without children? Couldn't happen. Abraham knew that. He wasn't stupid. He knew that. And he said, well, if I'm supposed to sacrifice him, then I guess God is going to raise him from the dead, because this is the only way it can happen. He'd been following God a long time, and he'd come to understand God fulfills his promises. We would do well to understand that lesson in our lives as well. And I think he really saw it in this way. I'm going to do what God tells me to do, and ultimately I'm not in charge. God is sovereign. God has told me to do this. I'm going to do it. So if I do this, it now becomes God's problem. And I'm going to trust that God knows exactly what he's doing, even if it means that he has to raise my son from the dead. I can't imagine the relief and the joy that Abraham must have felt when the angel spoke. Sort of that debilitating, oh, thank you, finally. I don't have to kill my son. I can't imagine that. But the thing that we see is that Abraham was faithful, and he was willing to sacrifice, and his reasoning was that if I do this, God must have a way that will make this work. I don't know what it is, but then again, I'm not God. So God must have a way that this is going to work somehow. Now, reading on in verses 20 through 22, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Why are these verses included with the story of Abraham? Well, remember, all of Abraham's life was focused in two directions: a promised land and a promised people. That's what God was going to do. And so it mentions the patriarchs, those who came immediately after Abraham, as a reminder to all of us, God did what he said he would do. There is now a promised land, and there is also now a promised people. And we see the story unfolding in those first three generations that took place after Abraham: Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And so let's look at Abraham's legacy. Number 3, Abraham's legacy. First of all, we see Isaac. We see Isaac's faith. Isaac's faith. Isaac blessed Jacob. Now, that's an interesting story in and of itself, isn't it? You remember the story? Isaac had 2 sons. One was older than the other, Esau and Jacob. Esau was older than Jacob, and he should have rightfully received the blessing from his father. But through a deceptive act, Jacob got the blessing. And so Isaac blessed, not knowing that he was blessing Jacob the first time. Later in the unfolding story of God's plan, Isaac willingly blessed Jacob at another point in his life. And he did so on purpose. So by faith, he knew his blessing would be perfectly fulfilled in the future. And that's exactly what happened. So God's plan was unfolding. It seems in God's word that it never unfolds exactly the way we think that it would unfold in reading the early parts of the story. We read the story, I know where this is going. I know where this is going. I didn't think it was going there. And we see this twist or this turn or this change. But in the end, God's promise is still fulfilled. There's still a clear understanding that God did this. And so Isaac's faith is seen through his blessing of his son Jacob, even though by human standards it seems that would be a wrong way to do it. And then in verse 21, we see Jacob. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Now from Jacob we have the 12 tribes. But he loved Joseph. And you know the story of Joseph. He was sold by his brothers into slavery because of their jealousy. He spent all of his life, from the time he was about 17 years old until his death, in Egypt, never returning back to the land of promise. But we see in Jacob at the very last stage of his life. So with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph in this passage, we see the end, how things were going at the end. And Jacob, at the very end, he asked for Joseph to bring his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So he brings Manasseh, the older of the two, and places him at his dad's, their granddad's, right hand. The place of honor, the place of privilege, the place of authority. Why? Because he was the oldest son, and that was the cultural norm. Then Ephraim was placed at the left hand. And Jacob was going to bless the sons of Joseph. You remember, Jacob wasn't the oldest. He received the blessing. And so what did Jacob do in his old age? He crossed his hands. And he put his right hand, the hand of authority and power and leadership, on the head of Ephraim. He put his left hand on the head of Manasseh. And he blessed that way. And Joseph even tried to correct him, and Jacob said, no, I know what I'm doing. That's the blessing he gave. In the longer story of Israel, you see later in the unfolding story of God that the tribe and the leadership of those related to Ephraim were greater than those related to Manasseh. So we see that God blessed, and God did that. Again, not how we would have seen it happening, but it's more of that unfolding sense of the promise of the descendants and the blessing and the leadership and the provision of God through these people, messed up, broken, dysfunctional sometimes people. God did his great work anyway. Sounds a lot like us. That's how God chooses to do it. And then we see Joseph at the end of his life in verse 22. By faith, Joseph at the end of his life made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Well, that's kind of interesting that though he did not spend most of his life in the land of promise, he wanted to be buried there. He wanted ultimately that to be his physical resting place. And it's really fascinating when you know that that's exactly what happened. There are two verses. If you're taking notes, you may want to write these down because it's just really cool what God did. First of all, we see in Exodus chapter 13, Exodus 13, verse 19. Moses, this is during the time of Exodus, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him For Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here, as they were leaving Egypt. They're getting ready to go, and somebody says, wait, don't forget Joseph. Somebody go get his bones. We're supposed to take him with us. And then, fast forward 40 years hence, we see the culmination in Joshua. You remember Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land because of his own disobedience and struggles and brokenness. But Joshua leads the people into the promised land, takes the land, and in Joshua, at the end of the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 32, as for the bones of Joseph, they still have the bones. They've been carrying bones around for 40 years. So the author decides we should probably update the people, the readers. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and it became an inheritance to the descendants of Joseph. Exactly the way Joseph said it would happen. These were faithful, obedient, blessed people that God used for his glory. And we look back on those stories and we think, wow, these people were amazing. Look at how obedient they were. Look at how they followed after God. And I submit to you that there is no difference in us today if we will be obedient, if we will be faithful, if we will trust that God is who he says he is, and that he has a plan for his people, and that the same God who led Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the children through Moses, the children of Israel, out of Egypt into the promised land, back to the promised land. I promise you that that is the same God today that has a perfect plan for our lives. All three patriarchs after Abraham ended well, but we really see in Abraham the foundational and formative example set, and they were following in their forebears' footsteps. He learned through struggle and brokenness that God's word never fails. And we can learn that same lesson today through our own struggle, our own brokenness, our own pain, our own disappointment, that God's word never fails. Everything else fails. Everything. Everything. People around you fail. Marriages fail. Children fail. Jobs fail. Provision fails. Your own health fails. Everything is broken and breaking and falling apart. But God, by his word, never fails. Never. So, with that, some questions. Do you believe God's word? I mean, believe it. That it is true. Do you believe God's word? Do you believe God's word about Jesus? That he is the way, the truth, and the life. Do you believe God's word about salvation? That there is no way under heaven by which men can be saved except through Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith. Do you believe God's word about judgment? That God will judge. Behold, it's appointed for man once to die, and then the judgment. Do you believe God's word about money? I mean, really believe it? Because it has more to say about money than any other single topic in its pages. How about that? Why? Because we love money. God knew it. So he gave a lot of instruction about how to manage it, lest it hold us. We're supposed to hold money. It's not supposed to hold us. But very often it holds us because all of our decisions seem to be centered around the acquisition of it, the use of it, the spending, all of that. So, do you believe God's word about money? Do you believe God's word about purity? About purity. God's word is very clear about purity in morality. It speaks very specifically that our moral fiber is tied completely to one thing that God instituted even before the church, and that is marriage. God says that all sexual relations should be within the confines of marriage. Period. End of story. Our world says that's crazy. Why would anyone think that that's normal? That's God's word. It is true. Do you believe it? Do you live it? Are you following God's word? Because what I've noticed in my own life is when I go off from God's word and still expect God to do what I need, and God, it's like he doesn't even hear me. Why? Because I'm not living in obedience to God's word. I've said that I believe God's word, but I don't live like I believe God's word. And then I'm surprised when God doesn't hear my prayer. It's like God is deaf to me. Yes, because I've snubbed my nose and said, I know better than you know, God. I know your word says thou shalt or thou shalt not, but I'm just going to do this because it seems more normal. God never said be normal. God said be obedient. Now, some of us are more abnormal than others. I don't think we should strive for abnormality, but we should strive for obedience. And when we obey God's word, it's amazing how clear things become. I didn't say easy. I didn't say simple. I didn't say soft. I just said clear. And we know that we know that we know. This might be the absolute hardest thing that God is calling me to do, but I know that that's what God's calling me to do. And I'm going to do it. And I'm going to stand at attention, figuratively speaking, in his presence and say, here I am, Lord, what do you want? Because that's what Abraham did. And we see that in the lives of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph so many different ways. Can it be seen in your life? That's what God is looking for. God is looking for that obedient person. Now, we're only able to do that because of Christ in us. Colossians says, Christ in you, the hope of glory. So, it begs the last question. If you believe God's word, do you obey God's word? I promise you that obedience to God's word brings the greatest blessing, the greatest satisfaction, the greatest joy, the greatest purpose, the greatest hope, the greatest confidence, the greatest contentment is in obeying God's word. He has given us this as a love letter for us. He knows stuff that we don't know. Follow this word, and you're following the heart of the Lord. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much for the example of faithfulness that we see in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Ruth, so many of the faithful in these pages. But Lord, here's what's interesting. Absolutely none of them were perfect. None of them perfectly followed you all of the time. Not a single one of them were perfectly obedient or perfectly faithful. And so, Lord, in that regard, we stand in exactly the same place. But they were people just like us. And now, Lord, because we've come after the new covenant, which is found in Christ's blood, this once-for-all sacrifice, the road has been paved for us to walk on it, to trust you, to follow your word. And we're given that authority not in our own right, but we're given that authority because of Christ in us. And so for those of us here who know you and have received that sacrifice as payment for our own sins, teach us to live in joyful obedience, recognizing that even when we don't fully understand, when we know what is right and we do it, you will honor and bless that in our lives. And then, Lord, for those here who do not yet know you as Lord and Savior, I pray that you would open their heart and their eyes to see and believe and follow after you. Thank you for what you're going to do in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand, please? We're going to sing together. You come, spend time in prayer. I'd love to talk with you about what it means to begin this relationship and connection to Jesus by way of the cross. He paid all so that you could come and receive that payment as payment for your own sins. I'd love to talk with you more about that. You come now as we sing together and as God leads.
Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth. Thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide. Strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. So I'll lift our voices. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. to me.
Paul writes in his letter to the church at Philippi, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Amen. God bless you.